Picture this. It's dawn in 1539, somewhere in what we now call Arizona. The sun is just starting to peek over mountain peaks that have no European names yet, and walking along paths worn smooth by thousands and thousands of footsteps. Apache women. Now, when I say walking, I don't mean wandering aimlessly. These women are moving with purpose across a landscape that sings to them. Every ridge, every water source, every stand of oak trees, it all means something. The Chiricahua know exactly when the mescal hearts will be ready for harvest. The Mescalero women can read weather patterns in cloud formations that would baffle modern meteorologists. The Jicarilla have mapped every game trail, from the Rio Grande to the Continental Divide. This is sophisticated stuff, folks. We're talking about women who controlled agricultural cycles across territories larger than some European kingdoms. When Spanish conquistadors first glimpsed Apache camps in 1540, they thought they were seeing primitive nomads. What they were actually witnessing was one of North America's most complex seasonal economies, and women were running it. Here's what gets me about this period. These Apache women weren't just following their husbands around, carrying babies and hauling firewood. They were making the decisions that kept entire societies alive. The harvest of mescal hearts each spring. That was women's work, but calling it gathering misses the point completely. This was botany, astronomy, and prophecy all rolled into one. Think about what that actually means. Apache women had to know when the agave plants had stored enough sugar to be worth harvesting. Too early, and you get bitter mush. Too late, and animals have eaten the hearts. They had to coordinate the timing across dozens of family groups. They had to know which plants were ready and which needed another season. And they had to do all this while managing logistics that would challenge a modern supply chain manager. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Among the Chiricahua there was a woman named Lozin, sister of the great chief Victorio. And Lozin had a gift that would make any military intelligence officer jealous. During ceremony, her palms would tingle when enemies were near. She could literally sense danger through some kind of, well, we'd probably call it intuition today, but the Apache knew it was something more. This wasn't folklore, understand? This was a tactical advantage that saved lives. Apache warriors trusted Lozin's gift completely. When her hands started tingling, raiding parties changed direction. When she felt nothing, they moved forward with confidence. In a world where the difference between life and death could be measured in minutes, having someone who could sense threats, that's not mysticism, that's military intelligence. But let's zoom out from individual stories and look at the bigger picture. The matrilineal clans. Now there's something that would have blown European minds if they'd understood it. Apache women didn't just remember family trees. They were living databases of kinship obligations, marriage alliances, and political relationships stretching across hundreds of miles. When a young Apache warrior wanted to marry, it wasn't his father who had the final say. It was his mother, his aunts, the clan mothers. They knew which marriages would strengthen the band and which ones would create dangerous conflicts. They remembered feuds that went back generations and alliances that needed reinforcing. Every wedding was a political decision, and women were making those decisions. Imagine being a Spanish conquistador trying to figure out Apache politics. You think you're dealing with a simple tribal chief, but behind every decision he makes, there's a network of women who've been analyzing the implications for weeks. You offer a trade deal, and while the chief is nodding politely, his wife is already thinking 3 moves ahead about what this means for next year's mescal harvest or the marriage negotiations with the band Two Valleys. Over the seasonal rounds were where you really saw this system in action. We're talking about families traveling hundreds of miles every year, from summer camps in the high mountains to winter settlements in protected valleys, moving elderly grandparents, pregnant mothers, infant children across scorching deserts and snow-capped peaks. Now think about the logistics for a second. How do you move 50 people, including babies and grandmothers, across terrain that would challenge a modern hiking enthusiast? How do you time it so you arrive at each location exactly when the food sources are ready? How do you coordinate with other bands so you're not competing for the same resources? Apache women figured this out centuries before anyone had heard of operations research. They developed what we'd recognize today as just-in-time delivery systems. They knew exactly how long it took to get from the mescal fields to the pinon groves, factoring in weather delays and the walking speed of the slowest family member. They maintained backup routes in case primary paths became dangerous. They established supply caches at strategic locations, and here's the thing that really gets me. They did all this while maintaining oral traditions that kept the entire cultural system intact. Every grandmother was a living library. Every mother was teaching her daughters not just how to gather food, but when to gather it, where to gather it, and what songs to sing while gathering it. The Spanish had no idea what they were looking at. They saw women digging roots and thought, "Oh, these people are just barely surviving." What they were actually witnessing was an agricultural system so sophisticated that it had sustained populations for over 1,000 years without depleting the environment. When Apache women controlled the mescal harvest, they weren't just feeding their families. They were managing a renewable resource across an ecosystem the size of several modern states. They knew which agave plants to harvest and which ones to leave for next year. They understood rotation cycles that kept the plant populations healthy. They had developed cooking techniques that could process tons of mescal hearts efficiently. But this wasn't just about food production. The mescal camps were where politics happened. While the mescal hearts were roasting in underground pits for days, the women were making decisions that affected everything from trade relationships to military alliances. Young people met potential spouses. Elders shared knowledge with the next generation. Information flowed between bands that might not see each other again for months. So when Spanish observers wrote about Apache gatherings, they were missing the point completely. These weren't casual social events. These were essentially congressional sessions, where the real business of Apache society got done, and the women weren't just participating in these decisions, they were driving them. The clan mothers could override war chiefs' decisions. If the women decided a proposed raid was too risky, it didn't happen. If they thought a peace treaty was necessary, the warriors listened. This wasn't because Apache men were weak or dominated. This was because Apache society had figured out something that European cultures were still struggling with: how to balance different types of wisdom in decision-making. The warriors understood combat and could read enemy intentions, but the women understood consequences that stretched across generations. They knew which decisions would affect children not yet born and alliances not yet made. When you're living in a world where one bad choice can destroy an entire band, you listen to the people who can see the biggest picture. Now, as we move toward the middle of the 16th century, all of this is about to collide with forces that Apache women could never have imagined. Spanish explorers are pushing north from Mexico. European diseases are beginning to spread along trade routes. Military technologies are advancing that will change warfare forever. But in 1540, in those last moments before contact, Apache women are at the height of their power. They control resources, make political decisions, and maintain cultural systems that have worked for centuries. They're raising children who know exactly who they are and where they belong in the world. The question that haunts me as we move into the next chapter is this: when three empires start colliding in Apache lands, Spanish, Mexican, and eventually American, how will these women adapt? How do you maintain traditions that depend on controlling vast territories when other people are claiming those same territories? How do you preserve a way of life that's based on freedom of movement when increasingly powerful governments want to control that movement? What's about to happen next will test every skill these Apache women have developed over generations. The mescal harvests will become battlegrounds, the seasonal rounds will become military campaigns, and the clan mothers who've been making political decisions for centuries will find themselves negotiating with representatives of empires they've never heard of. But here's what I want you to remember as we move forward. These aren't victims waiting to be rescued or primitives about to be civilized. These are sophisticated political leaders who've been managing complex societies for generations. When the lightning wars begin, Apache women won't be passive observers. They're going to be right in the middle of everything that happens next. The earth is trembling, not from earthquakes, from the collision of empires. And right in the middle of this chaos, Apache women are doing something that would make modern diplomats jealous. They're playing three superpowers against each other. And winning, picture the scene. It's 1821, and Mexico has just won its independence from Spain. The Spanish garrisons that have been keeping an uneasy peace on the Apache frontier are suddenly undermanned, undersupplied, and answering to a government that's too busy celebrating independence to worry about some remote desert outposts. Now, who do you think noticed this first? The Apache women. While Mexican officials in Mexico City were still figuring out how to run a country, women like Dos Tese were reading the political situation with the precision of intelligence analysts. Dos Tese, and here's where it gets interesting, married outside her tribe. Not for love, not for status, but for information. She married into different groups to create a network of alliances that gave the Apache advance warning about everything happening across the Southwest. This wasn't romantic diplomacy, folks. This was strategic marriage warfare. Dotese and women like her were creating intelligence networks that spanned from Sonora to Texas. When Mexican patrol schedules changed, Apache women knew about it before some Mexican commanders did. When American traders were planning new routes, Apache wives, married to Mexican officials, heard the conversations at dinner tables and passed the information along. Think about what this means in practical terms. You're an Apache war chief planning a raid. You don't just saddle up and ride out hoping for the best. First, you consult with the women who've been tracking Mexican military movements for months. They tell you which garrisons are at full strength and which ones are down to skeleton crews. They know which trade caravans are carrying weapons and which ones are just hauling pottery. They've mapped out safe routes and identified friendly settlements. This is military intelligence on a level that would impress modern generals. And it's being run by women who most Europeans still thought of as primitive camp followers, the legendary raids of the 1830s and 40s. Those weren't random acts of violence. They were calculated economic warfare, and Apache women were the logistical backbone that made them possible. When Mangas Coloradas and his warriors returned from a successful raid with hundreds of head of cattle, who do you think processed all that livestock? Apache women had developed distribution networks that would make Amazon envious. They could take a herd of stolen cattle and move it through a chain of allied bands, transforming live animals into jerky, hide goods, and trade items faster than any military pursuit could follow. They had processing stations set up in hidden canyons where dozens of women could work together to butcher, preserve, and package meat for long-term storage. But here's what really gets me about this period, the sheer audacity of the political strategy. Mangas Coloradas, one of the most famous Apache chiefs in history, married his daughters to other chiefs across the Southwest. Now, you might think this was just standard political marriage stuff, but look closer. These weren't random alliances. They were creating a communication network. When Mangas Coloradas needed to coordinate with the Chiricahua band 200 miles away, he didn't send smoke signals. He sent his daughter. The woman who'd married into that band could carry detailed messages, negotiate complex agreements, and report back with intelligence that no male messenger could have gathered. These women moved between bands with a freedom that male warriors didn't have. They could enter enemy camps under the protection of kinship ties, observe military preparations, and leave with information that would determine the outcome of battles. The Apache women were essentially running a diplomatic corps that operated across ethnic and political boundaries. They maintained relationships with Mexican ranchers, American traders, and other Native American tribes simultaneously. They could switch languages mid-conversation, understand the cultural codes that governed different societies, and negotiate agreements that satisfied multiple competing interests. Now, let's jump forward to 1861 when the Apache Wars really exploded. The Americans have been in the Southwest for over a decade, and they're learning that Apache warfare is unlike anything they've encountered before. The U.S. Army is used to fighting European-style battles. Formations, supply lines, predictable tactics. What they're facing instead is something that seems almost supernatural. Apache war parties appear out of nowhere, strike with devastating precision, and vanish into landscape that seems to swallow them completely. American commanders are pulling their hair out, trying to figure out how the Apache always seem to know exactly where Army units are while remaining invisible themselves. What they don't understand is that Apache women have turned warfare into a science. While warriors are learning to fight, women are learning to support operations that span hundreds of miles and involve dozens of moving parts. They're manufacturing ammunition from stolen lead, using techniques that turn raw metal into perfectly crafted bullets. They're treating wounds with desert plants that work better than anything in Army medical kits. They're maintaining communication networks using mirror flashes and smoke signals that can relay messages across mountain ranges faster than military couriers. At Apache Pass in 1862, when Apache warriors fought the California Column for 2 days, here's what was happening behind the scenes. While the men were shooting it out with Army artillery, Apache women were hauling water up treacherous mountain paths under direct fire. Not because they had to, because they understood that without water, the defensive position would collapse in hours. Think about the courage that took. These women were making calculated decisions to risk their lives to keep their fighters alive. They weren't just supporting the war effort, they were making tactical decisions that determined whether battles were won or lost. But it goes deeper than battlefield support. Apache women were the intelligence network that made Apache military success possible. They were the ones who figured out that Army units moved on predictable schedules. They identified which officers could be bribed and which ones were incorruptible. They learned to read Army supply manifests and predict where vulnerable wagon trains would be traveling. The great Chief Cochise, who fought the Americans for over a decade, couldn't have sustained his campaigns without the logistical network that Apache women had created. Every time his warriors needed ammunition, food, or medical supplies, they turned to distribution systems that women had been refining for generations. And here's something that most military histories miss completely. Apache women were making strategic decisions about when to fight and when to negotiate. The warriors might have the glory, but the women were often the ones deciding whether a particular battle was worth the cost. They understood the bigger picture, how many warriors the band could afford to lose, whether the potential gains justified the risks, how a particular raid would affect relationships with other groups. This is where the marriage alliances became crucial. A woman married into a neighboring band wasn't just creating family ties, she was creating intelligence assets. When tensions were rising between different Apache groups, these women could provide early warning. When cooperation was needed for a major operation, they could lay the groundwork for negotiations. The Mexican War ended in 1848, and suddenly the Apache found themselves dealing with a third empire, the Americans. Now, most people would assume this made things more complicated for the Apache. But for Apache women who'd been juggling Spanish-Mexican politics for decades, adding a third player actually created new opportunities. American officials arrived, expecting to find simple, tribal societies that they could control through traditional treaty-making. What they encountered instead were political networks run by women who'd been outmaneuvering European colonial governments for over 300 years. The Americans brought interpreters who spoke Apache languages, but they had no idea how Apache political decision-making actually worked. When American negotiators met with Apache chiefs, they thought they were dealing with absolute rulers who could make binding decisions on the spot. What they didn't understand was that behind every chief was a network of clan mothers who were the real power brokers. The chief might nod and agree to American proposals during the day, but that night he was reporting to women who would decide whether those agreements were actually acceptable. Apache women had figured out something that American officials never quite grasped. You could agree to treaties without actually surrendering any real power. You could accept gifts and promises while maintaining your own agenda. You could appear to comply with American demands while continuing to operate according to Apache priorities. The result was a series of agreements that both sides interpreted completely differently. Americans thought they were establishing control over Apache territories. Apache women understood they were accepting temporary arrangements that could be modified or abandoned whenever circumstances changed. This diplomatic double game reached its peak during the 1850s, when Apache raiders were simultaneously negotiating with Mexican officials, American territorial governments, and military commanders from multiple jurisdictions. Apache women were coordinating intelligence that let their warriors know exactly which authorities were communicating with each other and which ones could be played against each other. But by the end of the 1850s, this delicate balancing act was becoming impossible to maintain. The American Civil War was approaching, and military technologies were advancing in ways that would fundamentally change the nature of warfare. The communications networks and marriage alliances that had served Apache women so well were about to face challenges unlike anything they'd encountered before. The lightning wars of the next decade would test every skill these women had developed over generations. The question haunting the Apache camps as the 1860s approached was whether the strategies that had worked against Spanish colonial forces and Mexican frontier armies would be effective against American military resources that seemed unlimited. What was about to happen would shatter more than military formations. It would break apart families, destroy sacred sites, and force Apache women to make choices that no generation before them had ever faced. The diplomatic networks they'd spent centuries creating were about to collide with forces that didn't recognize diplomatic immunity, marriage alliances, or traditional rules of warfare. The mountains were about to weep, and Apache women would bear witness to horrors that would haunt their people for generations to come. April 30th, 1871. Camp Grant, Arizona Territory. It's just before dawn, and over 100 Apache people are sleeping under the protection of the United States Army. Women, children, elderly grandparents, all of them trusting in promises that seemed solid as the mountains surrounding their camp. In 2 hours, they'll be dead. Now I want you to understand what Camp Grant represented to these Apache families. This wasn't just another military post. This was supposed to be proof that peace was possible. Lieutenant Royal Whitman had convinced these Apache bands to come in from the desert, to try living under Army protection while negotiating a permanent peace. For months it had been working. Apache women were trading with local merchants. Children were playing games with soldiers. And old men were sharing stories with anyone willing to listen. The women at Camp Grant had made a decision that went against everything their mothers had taught them. They had chosen to trust white men's promises. And on this particular morning, that trust was about to be repaid with mass murder. Here's what happened. While the Apache slept, a vigilante force of 148 men was moving through the darkness toward their camp. Americans from Tucson, Mexican vaqueros, Tohono O'odham warriors, all united by one thing. They wanted every Apache in Arizona Territory dead. They'd spent weeks planning this attack, and they'd timed it perfectly. Most of the Apache men were away hunting, leaving behind mainly women, children, and elders. The attack began just as the sun was rising. No warning shots, no demands for surrender. Just clubs and knives and point-blank gunfire directed at sleeping families. Apache women woke to see their children's heads being crushed with rocks. Pregnant mothers were disemboweled while still alive. Babies were torn from their mothers' arms and thrown against canyon walls. In 30 minutes, it was over. 108 Apache people were dead. Only 8 were adult men. The rest were women and children who had committed no crime other than believing in the possibility of peace. But here's the detail that haunts me most. The attackers scalped their victims and took trophies back to Tucson, where they displayed them in the town square. The people of Tucson celebrated this massacre like a military victory. They held parades. Children were brought out to see the scalps of Apache children. One survivor was a woman named Cheetah. She crawled out from under the bodies of her family and lived to tell what she had witnessed. Cheetah spent the rest of her life carrying memories that would poison any possibility of trust between her people and the Americans. When later officials tried to convince Apache bands to surrender peacefully, Cheetah would speak at the councils. She would describe in precise detail what American promises were actually worth. The Camp Grant massacre shattered something fundamental in Apache understanding of the world. These women had believed that some Americans were different from others. They had thought that military officers were honorable men who kept their word. They had imagined that surrendering peacefully would protect their children. All of those beliefs died in the dirt at Camp Grant. Now, the great Chief Cochise had been fighting Americans for over a decade by this point. But after Camp Grant, his war changed character completely. Before the massacre, Cochise fought for tactical advantages, better treaty terms, territorial concessions, protection for his people. After Camp Grant, he fought with the fury of a man who understood that negotiation was impossible. But here's what most military histories miss. The decision to continue fighting wasn't made by Cochise alone. It was made by Apache women who had to live with the consequences of whatever choice their leaders made. And after Camp Grant, those women knew exactly what American protection was worth. Cochise's wife, her name isn't recorded in most histories, but her influence shaped everything that happened next, became the voice arguing against any further attempts at peace. She had friends among the Camp Grant dead. She had held Apache babies who were murdered in their sleep. When American negotiators approached Cochise over the next year, his wife's counsel was simple. These people cannot be trusted with Apache lives. The raids that followed Camp Grant were different from anything Americans had seen before. Apache war, parties began targeting civilians with a systematic brutality that matched what had been done to their own families. Towns were burned, wagon trains were annihilated, and settlers who had never seen an Apache warrior learned to fear shadows on the horizon. Apache women played crucial roles in sustaining this campaign of revenge. They manufactured ammunition with skills that amazed even experienced gunsmiths. They treated wounds using desert medicines that kept warriors fighting when conventional medical care would have failed. They maintained supply lines that allowed Apache raiders to operate hundreds of miles from their base camps. But most importantly, they preserved the memory of what had been done. Every Apache child born after 1871 grew up hearing detailed accounts of the Camp Grant massacre. Every young warrior learned the names of the dead and understood exactly why peace with Americans was impossible. For over a year after Camp Grant, Cochise waged total war against American settlements in Arizona Territory. His raiders struck with precision that suggested intelligence networks the army couldn't penetrate. They appeared where least expected and vanished into landscape that seemed to swallow entire war parties. American officials began to understand that they were facing not just military resistance, but entire populations committed to their destruction. By 1872, it was becoming clear that neither side could completely destroy the other. The Americans had superior numbers and resources, but Apache knowledge of the terrain and support from Apache women made decisive victory impossible. The Apache could inflict devastating casualties, but they couldn't prevent American reinforcements from arriving indefinitely. This stalemate created an opportunity for a different kind of negotiation. General Oliver Howard arrived in Arizona Territory with instructions to end the Apache wars through diplomacy rather than extermination. But Howard discovered that talking peace with Apache leaders was more complicated than anyone in Washington had imagined. The formal negotiations took place between Howard and Cochise. But Apache women were present at every meeting. They didn't speak directly to American officials that would have violated protocol, but they communicated through subtle signals that Apache men had learned to read over decades of marriage. A particular way of arranging blankets meant this offer is acceptable. A specific pattern of movement meant these terms need modification. Certain positioning relative to the fire meant walk away from this negotiation immediately. General Howard wrote in his memoirs about feeling unseen eyes evaluating his every word during the peace talks. He was more perceptive than most American officials. He understood that Apache decision-making involved players he couldn't identify or communicate with directly. But he never figured out that Apache women were conducting a parallel negotiation that would determine whether any agreement actually held. The final peace treaty between Cochise and the United States was signed in October 1872. Cochise agreed to move his people to a reservation in the Dragoon Mountains. The Americans agreed to provide food, supplies, and protection. Both sides understood they were making concessions that their hardliners opposed. But here's what made this treaty different from dozens of previous agreements that had been broken within months. Cochise's wife had concluded that continuation of the war meant total annihilation of their people. Not defeat, extinction. She had calculated the casualties that a prolonged conflict would produce and determined that even a bad peace was better than the complete destruction of Apache culture. This wasn't surrender born of weakness. This was strategic thinking that looked beyond immediate military considerations to long-term survival of the people. Apache women had been making these kinds of calculations for generations, but never under circumstances this desperate. The surrender ceremonies that followed revealed how deeply Camp Grant had changed Apache society. Traditional rituals that celebrated warriors returning home were replaced by mourning songs for a way of life that would never return. Women who had once welcomed victorious raiders now keened death songs for their own future. Children who should have been celebrating their father's return home instead clung to grandmothers who whispered, "Remember who you are," in Apache languages that government officials were already planning to forbid. Cochise kept his peace with the Americans until his death in 1874, but his surrender opened floodgates that would sweep away every remaining Apache band over the next dozen years. Victorio's band held out until 1879. Nana's followers resisted until 1881. And finally, Geronimo's people fought until 1886. Each surrender followed the same pattern. Negotiations conducted by men, but with Apache women making the real decisions through signals invisible to American officials. Military leaders agreeing to terms, while women calculated the long-term costs of resistance versus the immediate costs of surrender. Warriors laying down weapons, while their wives packed what few possessions they could carry into an uncertain future. But the most heartbreaking scenes were the separations. American policy required that Apache families be divided, men sent to military prisons, women and children shipped to reservation schools, elders abandoned to die without traditional care. Apache women watched their sons taken away in chains, knowing they might never see them again. They held daughters who would grow up speaking English instead of Apache, learning to read instead of learning to read the desert. The final surrender came in 1886, when Geronimo and his last 38 followers agreed to lay down their weapons. But by then, the damage was complete. Over 400 Apache people were loaded into cattle cars for transport to prison camps in Florida. Families that had survived Spanish conquest, Mexican independence, and American territorial expansion were torn apart by railroad schedules and bureaucratic procedures. The women who boarded those trains carried memories that would haunt Apache communities for generations. They remembered when their grandmothers controlled the mescal harvest, and their mothers made political decisions that affected entire regions. They remembered when Apache camps were centers of diplomatic activity and economic networks that spanned the continent. Now they were prisoners, shipped east like livestock toward prison camps in climates that would kill many of them within months. As the trains pulled away from Arizona territory, Apache women looked back at mountains that had been sacred to their people for over 1,000 years. They were leaving behind graves, ceremonial sites, and landscapes that contained the entire history of their civilization. But they were also carrying something the Americans couldn't confiscate: the knowledge of who they had been and who they might become again. In the darkness of those cattle cars, Apache grandmothers began teaching their grandchildren songs that government officials would spend decades trying to silence. The mountains were weeping, but Apache women were already planning for survival. September 18th, 72. San Carlos Reservation, Arizona Territory. The first delivery of beef cattle is about to arrive, and Apache women are gathering to witness something that will change their people forever. 500 pounds of fresh beef. Every week, regular as clockwork. Now think about what this meant to people who had spent their entire lives understanding hunger as a sacred teacher. Apache women knew the spiritual rhythm of feast and famine. They understood that scarcity taught you to value abundance, that the difficulty of obtaining food made every meal a celebration, that the uncertainty of tomorrow's meal made today's more precious, and now the Americans were offering to eliminate that uncertainty completely. The cattle came from Texas longhorns that had been driven across hundreds of miles of desert to reach San Carlos. Tough, stringy animals that bore no resemblance to the sweet venison and elk meat that Apache hunters had provided for generations. But there was so much of it. More meat than many Apache families had seen in months of traditional hunting. Dilchthi, wife of a prominent chief, whose name the Americans couldn't pronounce correctly, organized the Apache women to receive this first beef delivery with proper ceremony. She understood that how they handled this moment would determine whether their people maintained dignity or descended into chaos. Here's what gets me about Dilchth's response. She could have rejected the beef entirely, could have insisted that her people continue hunting and gathering as their ancestors had done. Instead, she chose to transform humiliation into dignity. She established protocols for dividing the beef that followed traditional kinship rules, ensuring that elders received the best portions and that no family went without meat. But the spiritual cost was enormous. Apache women had always controlled food distribution through complex networks of reciprocity and obligation. A successful hunt created relationships that lasted for years. The hunter owed portions to specific relatives, who in turn owed services to other families, creating webs of mutual dependency that held Apache society together. Government beef eliminated all of that. When food comes from outside your community, when you don't have to work together to obtain it, when your survival doesn't depend on maintaining relationships with dozens of other people, the social bonds that had held Apache bands together for centuries begin to weaken. The children born in these early reservation years grew up thinking daily meat was normal. They never knew the spiritual significance of hunger overcome through skill and courage. They never learned to value food that had been earned through cooperation and planning. To them, meat was something that arrived on schedule, distributed by officials they didn't respect, prepared by mothers who seemed defeated by abundance. Grandmothers wept, watching their grandchildren take food for granted. They saw in that casual attitude toward meat the death of Apache's self-reliance. They understood that children who never experienced scarcity would never learn the skills that had kept Apache people alive for generations. But some Apache women discovered unexpected opportunities in the beef distribution system. Women like Dilchthi learned to read scales and ledgers, to negotiate with Indian agents who controlled their people's survival. They gradually inserted themselves into the bureaucracy that ruled reservation life, finding ways to influence decisions that affected their families. This was political adaptation on a level that would have impressed their grandmothers. The same skills that Apache women had used to manage seasonal migrations and coordinate with other bands were now being applied to navigating federal bureaucracy. They learned which officials could be trusted and which ones were corrupt. They figured out how to use government procedures to protect Apache interests. The weekly beef deliveries became opportunities for cultural transmission that government officials never recognized. While waiting for their meat allocations, Apache women exchanged information about hidden ceremonies, arranged marriages according to traditional clan rules, and planned activities that maintained Apache identity under the noses of their supervisors. Federal agents thought they were witnessing orderly food distribution. What was actually happening was a weekly council meeting where Apache women made decisions that affected every aspect of reservation life. They determined which families needed extra help, which young people were ready for traditional responsibilities, and which government policies could be safely ignored. Nalindas Chin, whose American name was recorded as Nancy in government documents, taught her daughters to butcher the government beef using ritual cuts that were meant for deer. She maintained proper spiritual relationships with meat even when it came from domestic cattle that had been killed by strangers, using methods that violated every Apache understanding of how animals should be treated. This was cultural survival through adaptation. Rather than abandoning Apache practices entirely, women like Nalindas Chin found ways to maintain traditional relationships with the natural world, even under completely artificial circumstances. They blessed government beef with prayers meant for wild game. They distributed it according to kinship obligations that predated European contact. They taught their children to be grateful for meat, even when gratitude felt like betrayal of everything their ancestors had believed. The psychological impact on Apache men was devastating. Warriors who had once provided for their families through skill and courage now watched their wives receive meat from strangers. Hunters, who had earned respect through their ability to track game across difficult terrain, were reduced to spectators at weekly cattle distributions. Some Apache men tried to maintain traditional hunting practices, but the reservation boundaries made this almost impossible. The animals they had hunted for generations were now on land, controlled by white ranchers who shot Apache hunters on sight. The seasonal rounds that had provided variety in Apache diet were now forbidden by military commanders who insisted that all Apache people remain near the agency headquarters. Apache women found themselves managing not just food distribution, but the emotional devastation that came with the destruction of traditional male roles. They had to maintain respect for husbands who no longer provided, encourage sons who saw no future in traditional skills, and preserve cultural knowledge that seemed increasingly irrelevant to survival. But here's what the government officials never understood. Apache women weren't passive recipients of federal charity. They were actively transforming the beef distribution system into something that served Apache interests. Rather than merely government convenience, women's councils that met during beef distributions began making decisions that affected every aspect of reservation life. They decided which families would receive extra rations during emergencies, which children would be hidden from government school officials, and which traditional ceremonies could be conducted safely without attracting unwanted attention. The beef itself became a medium of exchange in underground economies that federal agents never detected. Apache women traded beef for items they couldn't obtain through government channels: traditional medicines, materials for basket making, information about relatives on other reservations. They created distribution networks that bypassed official channels entirely. By the late 1870s, some Apache women had become so skilled at managing the beef distribution system that they effectively controlled resource allocation for their entire communities. They knew which officials could be influenced through personal relationships, which procedures could be manipulated to Apache advantage, and which rules could be safely violated without triggering government retaliation. This was political sophistication that built on centuries of Apache diplomatic experience. The same women who had once negotiated with Spanish colonial officials and Mexican territorial governments were now learning to work within American bureaucratic systems. They understood that survival required adapting to new power structures while maintaining core cultural values. The children growing up during this period received mixed messages that would shape Apache identity for generations. From their mothers, they learned that accepting government food was necessary for survival, but also a form of spiritual compromise. From their grandmothers, they heard stories about the dignity of earning food through traditional methods. From government officials, they were told that their old ways were primitive and that civilization required dependence on white institutions. Some young Apache people embraced government promises and tried to become successful within the reservation system. Others rejected everything associated with white culture and sought ways to return to traditional lifeways. Most found themselves caught between worlds, never fully comfortable with either traditional Apache culture or American civilization. Apache women bore the burden of managing these cultural contradictions. They had to prepare government beef in ways that maintained some connection to traditional practices while acknowledging that the spiritual relationship between Apache people and the animals they ate had been permanently severed. They had to teach their children to be grateful for food that represented the destruction of everything their ancestors had valued. The weekly cattle deliveries continued through the 1870s and 80s, each one a reminder of Apache dependence on government goodwill. The meat sustained Apache bodies while slowly eroding Apache souls. Children who should have learned hunting skills instead learned to wait for government distributions. Young women who should have mastered the complex knowledge needed to process wild game instead became experts at bureaucratic procedures. But something else was happening during these years that government officials completely missed. Apache women were developing skills that would serve their people well in the 20th century. They were learning to navigate complex institutions, to read legal documents, to negotiate with officials from different cultural backgrounds. They were preparing for a world where Apache survival would depend not on hunting skills but on political sophistication, the beef that was supposed to make Apache people dependent on government charity was actually creating a generation of Apache women who understood how to manipulate government systems to Apache advantage. They were learning lessons that would prove crucial when Apache tribes began asserting sovereignty rights decades later. As the 1880s progressed, the weekly beef distributions became routine parts of reservation life. Apache women had transformed government charity into community organizing opportunities. They had maintained cultural practices under circumstances their grandmothers could never have imagined. They had adapted ancient diplomatic skills to modern bureaucratic challenges. The beef still tasted like defeat, but it was keeping Apache people alive while they learned skills that would eventually help them reclaim control over their own destinies. Between 1887 and 1924, something extraordinary happened. The United States government launched the most comprehensive cultural destruction program in human history, and Apache women defeated it, not through warfare, not through political resistance, through something far more powerful, the patient determination of grandmothers who refused to let their culture die. 7,000 Apache children were ripped from their families during these years, loaded onto trains bound for boarding schools designed to kill the Indian and save the man. Government officials were confident that one generation in these schools would eliminate Apache culture forever. They had no idea they were dealing with women who had been preserving knowledge through Spanish conquest, Mexican independence, and American territorial expansion for over 3 centuries. The boarding schools were weapons of cultural warfare, more devastating than any military campaign. Children as young as 5 were taken from their mothers and transported hundreds of miles to institutions where speaking Apache meant beatings, where traditional hairstyles meant public humiliation, where any expression of Apache identity meant punishment that would traumatize children for life. But here's what government officials never understood. Apache grandmothers like Maria Chateau were smarter than the entire federal bureaucracy. Maria Chateau created underground networks of cultural transmission that operated right under the noses of government agents. In hidden camps away from agency headquarters, she taught Apache girls the sunrise ceremony by moonlight. These weren't casual gatherings. They were carefully organized educational sessions that could be disbanded at a moment's notice if authorities approached. The women developed codes that allowed them to communicate traditional knowledge through activities that appeared harmless to white observers. Basket weaving patterns carried ceremonial instructions. Lullabies contained hunting songs that children could learn without understanding their significance. Stories told around evening fires contained maps of sacred sites and descriptions of traditional practices. Apache women memorized entire ceremonial cycles, becoming living libraries when sacred objects were confiscated by government agents. They learned to hide medicine bundles inside government-issued mattresses, to weave traditional patterns into modern baskets sold to tourists, and to sing religious songs as children's entertainment that federal officials dismissed as meaningless crooning. This was cultural preservation on a scale that would challenge modern data storage systems. Apache women were maintaining oral traditions that contained thousands of years of accumulated knowledge while pretending to comply with government programs designed to destroy those same traditions. The weekly beef distributions became perfect cover for this underground educational network. While waiting for their meat rations, Apache women exchanged information about hidden ceremonies, coordinated teaching schedules, and planned activities that maintained Apache identity despite government surveillance. Federal agents thought they were witnessing orderly food distribution among properly pacified Indians. What was actually happening was a weekly congress, where Apache women made decisions that would preserve their culture for future generations. They determined which children were ready to learn specific ceremonies, which adults could be trusted with sensitive cultural knowledge, and which traditional practices could be maintained without attracting unwanted government attention. Nalinda's Chin had developed techniques for cultural transmission that were so subtle they appeared invisible to outside observers. She taught her daughters to butcher government beef using ritual cuts meant for deer, maintaining proper spiritual relationships with food even under completely artificial circumstances. She showed them how to prepare traditional medicines using plants that grew near the reservation, disguising pharmaceutical knowledge as casual gardening. But the most important preservation work happened in the spaces between official activities. Apache women created informal schools that operated during times when government agents assumed their charges were engaged in approved domestic activities. While appearing to do laundry, they taught traditional songs. While preparing meals, they transmitted ceremonial knowledge. While caring for children, they maintained educational systems that had functioned for centuries. The psychological pressure on these women was enormous. They were raising children in two completely different cultural systems simultaneously. During the day, Apache mothers taught their children to comply with government expectations, to speak English, to adopt white customs, to suppress any expression of traditional identity. At night, the same women taught the same children Apache languages, ceremonial practices, and cultural values that contradicted everything they had learned during official hours. This required emotional strength that's difficult to imagine. Apache women had to watch their children suffer through educational experiences designed to destroy everything they valued while pretending to support those same programs. They had to maintain relationships with government officials who were systematically attacking their culture, while secretly working to preserve the knowledge those officials were trying to eliminate. Some Apache children couldn't handle the psychological strain of living in two worlds simultaneously. They rejected traditional culture entirely and tried to become successful within white society. Others rebelled against government programs and sought ways to return to pre-contact lifeways. Most found themselves caught between cultures, never fully comfortable in either world. Apache women bore the burden of managing these cultural contradictions for their entire families. They had to help children navigate between competing value systems while maintaining their own sanity in circumstances that would have broken less determined people. They had to preserve ancient knowledge while adapting to modern realities that made much of that knowledge seem irrelevant, but here's what sustained. These women, through decades of cultural warfare, they understood that they were fighting for something larger than their own generation. They were preserving knowledge that belonged to Apache people who hadn't been born yet. They were maintaining cultural resources that future generations might need, even if those resources seemed useless under current circumstances. This long-term thinking reflected centuries of Apache experience with cultural adaptation. Apache women had learned to preserve core cultural values while adapting surface behaviors to changing circumstances. They understood the difference between tactical compromises and strategic surrender. The boarding school system reached its peak intensity during the first 2 decades of the 20th century. By 1920, over 4,000 Apache children were enrolled in institutions specifically designed to eliminate their cultural identity. Government officials were confident that Apache culture would be extinct within 1 generation. They had no idea that Apache women were simultaneously running parallel educational systems that were transmitting traditional knowledge more effectively than the boarding schools were transmitting white culture. Apache children who appeared completely assimilated during school hours were learning ceremonial songs during summer vacations. Young people who spoke perfect English in government classrooms were receiving traditional names in hidden ceremonies. Their teachers never knew about the underground preservation networks developed, security procedures that would have impressed professional intelligence organizations. Different women specialized in preserving different aspects of Apache culture, ensuring that no single arrest could destroy crucial knowledge. They established backup systems for transmitting information if primary teachers were discovered and punished. They created code words that allowed them to discuss traditional practices in the presence of government officials without arousing suspicion. By the early 1920s, Apache women had been operating these cultural preservation networks for over 3 decades. They had successfully transmitted traditional knowledge to children and grandchildren who had been raised in boarding schools designed to eliminate that same knowledge. They had maintained ceremonial practices under circumstances that should have made such preservation impossible. When anthropologist Maurice Opler arrived at San Carlos in 1931 to study Apache culture, he expected to find fragments of a dying civilization. Instead, he discovered traditional practices that had remained intact despite 40 years of systematic government efforts to destroy them. Opler realized that he was witnessing one of the most successful cultural preservation efforts in human history. But what impressed Opler most was the sophistication of the preservation methods Apache women had developed. They hadn't simply maintained static traditions. They had adapted traditional practices to function under completely changed circumstances. They had preserved the essential spiritual and social functions of Apache culture while modifying the surface forms to avoid government detection, the beef distributions that had once symbolized Apache dependence on government. Charity had been transformed into opportunities for cultural transmission. The reservation system that was supposed to control Apache movement had become a base for underground educational networks. The boarding schools designed to eliminate Apache culture had inadvertently created alumni who could function in white society while maintaining traditional Apache identity. Apache women had turned every tool of cultural destruction into a means of cultural preservation. They had demonstrated that determined grandmothers were more powerful than entire government bureaucracies. They had proven that cultures could survive anything as long as women were willing to risk everything to preserve knowledge for future generations. As the 1920s progressed, it was becoming clear that government cultural destruction programs had failed completely. Apache children who had spent years in boarding schools were returning to their communities and seeking traditional knowledge that their grandmothers had kept alive. Through decades of secret teaching, the whispering winds of memory had preserved everything that mattered. Apache culture was about to emerge from underground and reclaim its place in the desert sun. 1934. The Indian Reorganization Act becomes law, and prison doors that had confined Apache spirits for 2 generations finally crack open. What emerges isn't the defeated remnant that government officials expected. It's a culture that had been secretly rebuilding itself for decades. Apache women step into the sunlight carrying everything their grandmothers had hidden in the darkness. The transformation began almost immediately. Public ceremonies that hadn't been seen for over 50 years suddenly reappeared on reservation landscapes. Apache girls who had grown up speaking English in boarding schools were learning traditional songs from grandmothers who had memorized them during the underground years. Young women who should have forgotten their cultural identity entirely were seeking initiation into ceremonies their great-grandmothers had preserved through decades of secret teaching. But here's what catches my attention about this cultural renaissance. It wasn't led by traditional male leaders or charismatic warriors. It was driven by women who had spent their entire lives preparing for exactly this moment. Vashola Jamula became the first female Apache chief in 1940. Now think about what that represented. This was a woman who had grown up during the worst years of cultural suppression, who had watched government agents confiscate sacred objects and punish children for speaking Apache languages. She had learned to navigate between traditional Apache authority structures and federal bureaucratic systems that didn't recognize women's political roles. When Viola Jamula took leadership of her band, she wasn't breaking with Apache tradition, she was reviving it. Apache women had always held political authority, but that authority had been hidden during the decades when any expression of traditional governance brought government retaliation. Now, for the first time in over 50 years, Apache women could exercise political power openly. The return of public ceremonies in the 1940s revealed just how successfully Apache culture had survived the underground years. Elderly women who had spent decades pretending to be assimilated Christians suddenly emerged as ceremonial leaders who remembered every detail of traditional practices. They taught forgotten songs to great-granddaughters who had been born in captivity but carried the genetic memory of freedom. In their bones, these weren't reconstructed traditions based on anthropological research or museum artifacts. These were living practices that had been maintained through an unbroken chain of secret transmission, from mothers to daughters across 2 generations of cultural warfare. The songs were exactly the same songs that had been sung before the reservations. The ceremonies followed precisely the same patterns that had structured Apache's spiritual life for centuries. Government officials were stunned. They had convinced themselves that Apache culture was extinct, that decades of boarding school education and reservation control had successfully transformed Apache people into productive American citizens. Instead, they discovered that everything they thought they had destroyed had simply gone underground and emerged stronger than before. Mildred Cleghorn represents everything that was happening during this period. Born on the Fort Sill reservation where Geronimo's band had been imprisoned, she grew up learning skills that no Apache woman had needed for generations: how to read legal documents, how to negotiate with federal bureaucrats, how to function in political systems that her grandmothers could never have imagined. But Mildred Cleghorn also learned traditional Apache skills from women who had kept them alive through the underground years. She understood ceremonial protocols, kinship obligations, and cultural values that connected her to centuries of Apache history. When she became the first Apache woman tribal chairperson, she brought both sets of skills to a job that required navigating between Apache community needs and federal government expectations. This was exactly what Apache women had been preparing for during the secret decades. They had raised daughters who could function successfully in white institutional settings while maintaining complete loyalty to Apache cultural values. They had created a generation of leaders who understood both traditional Apache governance and modern American political systems. The 1960s brought Apache women into the American Indian movement, where they discovered that their skills were needed far beyond their own reservations. Lenada Warjack occupied Alcatraz Island in 1969, declaring it better than most reservations and demanding that it be converted into an Indian cultural center and university. Now think about the audacity of that action. This was an Apache woman who had grown up on a reservation where her grandmothers had been punished for speaking their own language, where traditional ceremonies had been forbidden, where any expression of Indian identity had been treated as criminal behavior. And now she was occupying federal property and demanding not just civil rights, but cultural recognition. Lenada Warjack understood something that most Americans couldn't grasp, that Apache people didn't want to become white Americans. They wanted to be Apache Americans. They wanted to participate in American society while maintaining their own cultural identity. They wanted their children to learn both English and Apache languages, to understand both American history and Apache history, to function successfully in both worlds without being forced to choose between them. The occupation of Alcatraz lasted 19 months and attracted international attention to American Indian issues that had been ignored for decades. Apache women were central to the occupation's success, using organizational skills they had learned during the underground preservation years to maintain discipline and morale under extremely difficult circumstances. But the real transformation was happening back on the reservations, where Apache women were taking control of tribal governments and using their newfound political authority to implement changes their grandmothers could only have dreamed of. By the 1980s, women controlled major portions of tribal governments from San Carlos to Mescalero. They established cultural centers that celebrated traditions their mothers had been forced to hide. They fought for water rights that restored Apache control over resources that had sustained their people for centuries. They negotiated gaming compacts that brought unprecedented wealth to communities that had been deliberately kept in poverty for generations. The sunrise ceremonies returned in full glory during this period, with young Apache women like Autumn Gomez undergoing 4-day rituals exactly as their ancestors had for millennia. But these modern ceremonies incorporated elements that reflected the cultural evolution Apache people had experienced during the reservation years. Girls who participated in sunrise ceremonies learned traditional skills like hide tanning and basket weaving, but they also learned modern skills like computer programming and business management. They received traditional Apache names that connected them to their ancestral identity, but they also received college scholarships that would allow them to compete successfully in contemporary American society. This cultural synthesis represented everything that Apache women had been working toward for over a century. They had preserved traditional knowledge while adapting to modern circumstances. They had maintained cultural identity while developing skills needed for success in American institutional settings. They had raised children who were proud of their Apache heritage and confident in their ability to succeed in any environment they chose to enter. The beef that had once symbolized dependence and cultural destruction became just another food option as Apache nations developed diverse economies from timber to tourism to technology. Tribal enterprises generated millions of dollars in revenue that funded education, healthcare, and cultural preservation programs that served Apache communities throughout the Southwest. Modern Apache women like Dr. Kristen Hohag Wiley pursue advanced degrees while maintaining fluency in Apache languages. Their great-grandmothers had been forbidden to speak. They work as physicians, attorneys, engineers, and tribal administrators, while participating in traditional ceremonies that connect them to centuries of cultural continuity. The Fort Apache Heritage Foundation, directed by women who had learned organizational skills during the underground preservation years, teaches traditional skills to youth who might otherwise drift from their culture. Apache teenagers learn to weave baskets using techniques their great-grandmothers had practiced in secret, to prepare traditional foods using plants their ancestors had gathered for centuries, and to speak Apache languages that federal officials had once tried to eliminate completely. But these aren't museum programs designed to preserve static traditions for tourist consumption. These are living educational systems that prepare Apache youth to carry their culture into the 21st century while succeeding in whatever careers they choose to pursue. Apache young people who learn traditional hunting skills also learn environmental science. Apache girls who participate in traditional ceremonies also receive preparation for college and professional careers. Modern Sunrise. Ceremonies reveal the extraordinary cultural synthesis that Apache women have achieved over the past century. Girls wear traditional camp dresses made from materials their great-grandmothers could never have imagined while checking smartphones between ritual segments. They receive traditional teachings about women's roles in Apache society while preparing for careers in fields that didn't exist when their grandmothers were young. This isn't cultural confusion. It's cultural evolution guided by women who understand that traditions must adapt to survive while maintaining their essential spiritual and social functions. Apache girls who undergo sunrise ceremonies today learn the same fundamental lessons about responsibility, endurance, and community obligation that have structured Apache womanhood for centuries. But they apply those lessons in contexts that include college education, professional careers, and global travel. The synthesis works because Apache women have always been adaptable. The same flexibility that allowed their ancestors to thrive in desert environments and navigate between competing empires now allows their descendants to succeed in academic institutions and corporate boardrooms while maintaining strong connections to traditional Apache communities. The stories of women who preserved songs in government schools, who transformed beef rations into community gatherings, and who raised leaders in secret now inspire new generations of Apache women who face different challenges but draw on the same sources of strength. Contemporary Apache women understand that they are inheritors of a tradition of resistance and adaptation that has never been broken despite centuries of pressure. To abandon their cultural identity, Elder Evelyn Taduanipa speaks for all the women who kept Apache culture alive through the darkest periods of cultural suppression. They gave us beef to make us weak. We turned it into strength. That's what Apache women do. We transform whatever comes into power for our people. That transformation continues today as Apache nations develop economic and political strategies that build on traditional strengths while engaging successfully with contemporary American society. Apache women who once hid traditional knowledge to preserve it from government destruction now use that same knowledge to compete for federal grants, to develop sustainable tourism programs, and to educate non-Apache people about the sophisticated cultures that European colonizers had dismissed as primitive. The irony is perfect. Government programs designed to destroy Apache culture by forcing assimilation actually created Apache leaders who could outmaneuver federal bureaucrats using skills those same bureaucrats had tried to eliminate. Apache women learned to read legal documents in boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak Apache languages, then used their literacy skills to fight for treaty rights that protected Apache interests. They learned American political procedures in institutions designed to make them forget their own governance traditions, then used those procedures to restore traditional leadership roles that had been suppressed for generations. As we move deeper into the 21st century, Apache women continue to demonstrate that cultural preservation and modern adaptation are not contradictory goals. They are raising daughters who speak both English and Apache fluently, who understand both traditional ceremonies and contemporary technology, who can succeed in any environment while maintaining strong connections to the desert landscapes that have sustained Apache people for over a millennium. The eternal sunrise continues, each dawn bringing new Apache women into their strength, their culture intact and evolving, forever surprising those who thought fresh beef could buy surrender of the soul. Today, right now, as you're listening to this, Apache women stand as testament to the complete failure of cultural genocide. And I want you to think about what that means. In 2025, women hold 3 of 7 tribal council seats at White Mountain Apache. They control the Cultural Preservation Office at San Carlos. They run the Economic Development Corporation at Mescalero. These aren't ceremonial positions or token appointments. These are women making decisions that affect thousands of people and millions of dollars in economic activity. The beef rations that began 153 years ago have faded to historical memory, replaced by thriving tribal enterprises that generate wealth their great-grandmothers couldn't have imagined. Apache nations operate successful casinos, timber operations, tourism businesses, and technology companies that compete successfully in global markets. But here's what gets me about this transformation. It happened because Apache women never stopped being Apache women. They didn't succeed by abandoning their cultural identity and becoming imitation white Americans. They succeeded by taking the best of both worlds and creating something entirely new. Dr. Kristen Hohag Wiley represents everything that modern Apache women have achieved. She holds advanced degrees from universities that wouldn't have admitted Apache students 50 years ago. She conducts medical research that contributes to scientific knowledge that benefits people around the world. And she speaks Apache languages that federal officials once tried to eliminate completely. Dr. Hohag Wiley's career path would have been impossible for her great-grandmother, who grew up during the boarding school era when Apache girls were trained to become domestic servants for white families. But the cultural foundation that guides Dr. Hohag Wiley's work comes directly from traditions that her great-grandmother preserved during the underground years. Apache women in 2025 understand their professional success as a continuation of traditional responsibilities rather than a departure from them. They use modern skills to serve Apache communities in ways that fulfill ancient obligations to care for their people. They pursue careers that allow them to strengthen Apache culture rather than escape from it. The Fort Apache Heritage Foundation, directed by women who learned organizational skills from grandmothers who had operated secret cultural preservation networks, teaches traditional skills to Apache youth who might otherwise drift from their culture. These aren't nostalgic programs designed to preserve museum artifacts. These are dynamic educational systems that prepare Apache young people to carry their culture successfully into whatever future they encounter. Apache teenagers learn to weave baskets using techniques that have been practiced for centuries, but they also learn business skills that allow them to market their work to collectors around the world. Apache youth learn traditional hunting and gathering practices that connect them to ancestral lifeways. But they also learn environmental science that helps them manage natural resources sustainably for future generations. Modern sunrise ceremonies reveal the extraordinary cultural synthesis that Apache women have achieved. Girls wearing traditional camp dresses check smartphones between ritual segments, not because they're confused about their identity, but because they're comfortable navigating multiple worlds simultaneously. Young Apache women who undergo the 4-day sunrise ceremony learn the same fundamental lessons about endurance, responsibility, and community obligation that have structured Apache womanhood for millennia. But they apply those lessons in contexts that include college preparation, career planning, and global citizenship. This isn't cultural compromise, it's cultural evolution guided by women who understand that traditions must adapt to, survive while maintaining their essential spiritual and social functions. Apache girls who participate in sunrise ceremonies today receive traditional teachings about women's roles in maintaining community harmony, but they also receive preparation for careers in law, medicine, education, and business. The ceremony itself demonstrates how successfully Apache culture has adapted to contemporary circumstances. Traditional elements remain exactly as they were centuries ago: the ritual dancing, the sacred songs, the spiritual instruction that transforms girls into women. But modern elements have been integrated seamlessly: college scholarship presentations, career counseling sessions, and networking opportunities that help young Apache women succeed in whatever paths they choose. Elder Evelyn Tadua speaks for generations of Apache women who kept their culture alive through the darkest periods of suppression and emerged stronger than ever. They gave us beef to make us weak. We turned it into strength. That's what Apache women do. We transform whatever comes into power for our people. That transformation continues today as Apache women use traditional wisdom to address contemporary challenges. They apply ancient knowledge about sustainable resource management to develop environmental protection programs. They use traditional diplomatic skills learned from grandmothers who had negotiated with Spanish, Mexican, and American officials to represent Apache interests in complex legal and political situations. Apache women who once had to hide their cultural knowledge to preserve it from government destruction now use that same knowledge to compete successfully for federal grants, to develop cultural tourism programs that generate revenue for their communities, and to educate non-Apache people about the sophisticated societies that European colonizers had dismissed as primitive. The irony is perfect and complete. Government programs designed to destroy Apache culture by forcing assimilation actually created Apache leaders who could outmaneuver federal bureaucrats using skills those same bureaucrats had tried to eliminate. Apache women learned to read legal documents in boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak Apache languages, then used their literacy skills to fight for treaty rights that protected Apache sovereignty. They learned American political procedures in institutions designed to make them forget traditional governance systems, then used those procedures to restore leadership roles that had been suppressed for generations. Contemporary Apache women understand themselves as inheritors of an unbroken tradition of resistance and adaptation. They know that their ancestors survived Spanish conquest, Mexican independence, American territorial expansion, reservation imprisonment, and cultural genocide programs precisely because Apache women have always been willing to transform challenges into opportunities. This historical perspective gives modern Apache women confidence to engage with whatever changes the future brings. They've seen their great-grandmothers adapt to circumstances that should have destroyed their people completely. They've watched their grandmothers maintain cultural traditions under conditions that made such preservation seem impossible. They've observed their mothers reclaim political authority after decades of suppression. Now they're raising daughters who will face challenges that haven't been imagined yet, but they're confident that Apache women will find ways to transform whatever comes into power for their people. The same flexibility that allowed their ancestors to thrive in desert environments and navigate between competing empires now allows their descendants to succeed in academic institutions, corporate boardrooms, and international organizations. while maintaining strong connections to traditional Apache communities. The eternal sunrise continues, each dawn bringing new Apache women into their strength. Young Apache women who graduate from universities with advanced degrees return to their reservations not to escape their heritage, but to use their education in service of their people. They become tribal attorneys who protect Apache water rights, physicians who provide healthcare in traditional ways that respect Apache understanding of healing, engineers who develop sustainable technologies appropriate for desert environments, and educators who teach Apache children to succeed in both Apache and American cultural contexts. The beef that once symbolized cultural destruction and dependence has become just another food option in Apache communities that control diverse economic enterprises worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Apache nations operate successful businesses that provide employment for thousands of people while generating revenue that funds education, healthcare, and cultural preservation programs throughout Apache territories. But the most important success isn't measured in dollars or political positions. The most important success is cultural. Apache women have preserved and transmitted everything that matters about Apache identity while adapting successfully to circumstances. Their ancestors could never have imagined Apache languages that federal officials tried to eliminate are now taught in tribal schools and universities. Traditional ceremonies that were once conducted in secret are now practiced openly and attended by Apache people who have traveled from around the world to participate. Sacred sites that were once forbidden to Apache people are now protected by Apache women who use both traditional knowledge and modern legal systems to ensure their preservation for future generations. The circle is complete, but the story continues. Apache women who once walked paths worn smooth by countless generations of ancestors now walk paths that lead into a future where Apache culture will continue to evolve while maintaining its essential character. They carry smartphones and traditional medicine bundles, drive modern vehicles to ancient ceremonial sites, and use social media to maintain connections with Apache communities scattered across the globe. They've proven that cultures don't survive by remaining static. They survive by adapting while maintaining their core values and essential functions. Apache women have demonstrated that it's possible to succeed completely in contemporary American society while remaining completely Apache in identity and orientation. As the sun rises each morning over mountains that have been sacred to Apache people for over 1,000 years, Apache women begin new days that connect them simultaneously to ancestral wisdom and contemporary opportunities. Their culture is intact and evolving, forever surprising those who thought fresh beef could buy surrender of the soul. The eternal sunrise continues. Apache women continue to transform whatever comes into power for their people, and the desert wind still carries the whispered promises of grandmothers who knew that patience and determination could overcome any force that threatened their children's children. That's what Apache women do. They endure, they adapt, they transform, and they never ever surrender what matters most.